Hi, I'm Stuart Clark,
I'm Doreen.
and welcome to Holland Estates. You're listening to episode number 566.
Hey, Stuart, how are you?
Hi, Doreen. I'm good, thank you. How about yourself?
I'm good. Not bad.
Another fun day of podcasting with you. So today we're going to be talking about a topic that's kind of been top of mind or in the news recently. There was a marketplace show a couple weeks ago on CBC about mistreatment and sort of issues in long-term care homes. And there was also, for those who've been following the news, a rather kind of disturbing story out of the U.S. a couple weeks ago of a woman who actually was in a vegetative state in a long-term care home and became pregnant by, allegedly, one of the staff members there. So today we're kind of talking about what rights do a resident have, or does a resident have in a long-term care home? If there is alleged mistreatment or abuse or neglect, are there steps that a resident can take? And just kind of go over a general overview of what framework exists for enforcing your rights within a long-term care home.
That's right, because lo and behold, there's actually a Long-Term Care Homes Act of 2007. The act itself regulates all kinds of long-term care homes in Ontario. It sets out all the sort of like regulatory compliance that each home has to go through. It establishes reporting procedures and establishes investigation procedures. I think, as you said a little bit earlier while we were chatting beforehand, it's on the one hand to keep all of these homes honest and make sure that people are taken care of within the facilities, and to also actually give the residents in those facilities recourse and to let everybody know that you're there, your dignity is supposed to be maintained, it's supposed to be a safe place for you, and it's the idea that you should be cared for.
No, exactly. So, I guess importantly, or kind of the core of the rights that a resident has within this Long-Term Care Homes Act is actually a Bill of Rights. The government in 2007, when putting this statute together, actually enshrined within the statute itself a resident's Bill of Rights that set out the various rights that a resident has. And I'll read you some of them. I mean, they include the fact that every resident has the right to be protected from abuse. Every resident has the right not to be neglected by licensee or staff. Every resident has the right to be properly sheltered, fed, clothed, groomed, and cared for in a manner consistent with his or her own needs. Every resident has the right to live in a safe and clean environment. And it goes on from there. And there's a long list. There's in total, let's go down here, 27 statutorily enshrined rights that a resident has within the Bill of Rights. And you say, wow, that sounds great. But, at the same time, that sounds a bit wishy-washy. What does, every resident has the right to be protected from abuse mean? If you think that there's been an issue, well, what the heck do you do with that? I have this right, but how do I enforce this right? And this is where it kind of gets interesting, in the hypothetical at least, which is that the Bill of Rights, at the very end of it, Section 3.3 of the Long-Term Care Homes Act, 2007, basically says that a resident may enforce the Bill of Rights against the long-term care home as if the long-term care home and the resident had entered into a contract in which the long-term care home had agreed to uphold the rights. So arguably, if the resident feels that the long-term care home has breached one of the various rights given to them in the Bill of Rights, they can sue the long-term care home for breach of contract.
Right.
And in theory, get some kind of recourse against the home for breach of contract. So before this podcast, I actually noted up the act, and interestingly, or perhaps not surprisingly, there's no reported cases in which a resident has actually tried to enforce the Bill of Rights against a long-term care home. The only cases I could find are ones where there's been some kind of labor grievance between a union and the long-term care home over either lack of training over the Bill of Rights or some kind of other tangential issue related to the Bill of Rights, but never actually, hey, I as resident think you breached my rights, I'm going to sue you. So you're kind of, at this point, guessing in the hypothetical. So if you're suing for breach of contract, typically you'd be suing for damages, monetary damages. Well, are there monetary damages here? If someone has, not given you or has not protected you from abuse, have you suffered monetary damages? Well, maybe. I guess you could probably say pain and suffering, or maybe there's some kind of punitive damages saying, your conduct was so egregious that I need even more money. But, unlikely, or at least there's some question marks around, or is there some kind of monetary amount you can associate with that damage? The more likely scenario, or maybe that I would imagine, would be that you'd sue for a specific performance. If there was a history of abuse, history of, hey, my place isn't safe and clean, you could sue for specific performance saying, okay, long-term care home. You have to enforce your end of this contract here. You have to make sure that I'm safe. You have to make sure that it's clean here. You have to make sure that all the other rights that I allege you have breached are upheld.
Right. Yeah, so, in terms of how to proceed, the government guide on the Act talks a lot about sort of like the different ways complaints can be made. There's actually a very handy chart that sets out, different categories of complaints, such as, whether or not if your complaint is about abuse, if your complaint is about improper treatment, if your complaint is about misuse or misappropriation of state money. It talks about the different forms that you can file, and it talks about the obligations on the end of the actual facility. But what Stuart is talking about is something that perhaps you might want to think about if you've reached your end with the reporting mechanisms that are set out within the Act itself, and you want to go directly towards the enforcement of that contract. Now, whether or not you want to do it by statement of claim, maybe get at some of those damages, specific performance, or you might want to think about an application where you can interpret the statutory rights that you get from this Resident Bill of Rights that's enshrined within the Act, and in the course of that also seek either injunctive relief or mandatory orders, just sort of maybe like as the opposite side of the coin of the specific performance.
Exactly. So if you have gotten to that point where you're saying, I want to go commence this claim against the long-term care home, important things to remember are that the Bill of Rights looks to be personal in nature. It's a personal contract, in quotes here, between the long-term care home and the resident. So it's the resident who has to enforce that contract against the long-term care home. So this means if you're the kid or spouse of the resident, you probably don't have the personal right to step in there and say, hey, home, you need to uphold these rights. It would have to be the resident. So if the resident themselves is capable, they could, in theory, bring that claim personally. But if they're incapable, as is probably often the case in a long-term care home, then you're looking at a litigation guardian scenario. So someone, probably their POA or guardian, and there's a whole list in the rules about who has the first right to apply to be a litigation guardian, would step into their shoes and would commence this claim, in theory, against a long-term care home. So that's basically kind of the framework that exists right now. So if you are a resident of a long-term care home, and you think that your rights have been, breached, you do have some statutorily enshrined rights. The Bill of Rights is a statute currently in force in Ontario. You have these rights. The home has an obligation to uphold them. And if you think your rights are being breached, you have, in theory, at least, recourse to bring the matter before the court and seek damages, whether, monetary or specific performance of a contract against the long-term care home. So, as I said, no one's kind of put this out there right now. We're not sure. So we're not sure what the threshold the court's going to consider. If you do sue a long-term care home, there's no kind of guidance right now on what the standard of care is for a long-term care home, at what point the court's going to consider the conduct of the long-term care home so egregious or outrageous that they're actually going to find breach of contract under the Bill of Rights. So you'd be a little bit of a test case right now if you want to bring this forward, but I'm sure it's only a matter of time before someone says, you know what, I've had enough, and I'm gonna test my rights under the Bill of Rights. I'm gonna bring this forward, and I want the court to uphold my rights.
Yeah. And when it comes to test cases, it's also really important to really go back to first principles, because one of the first sections in this Act, it has a very, very long preamble, and it talks about what its fundamental principles are. And its fundamental principle is for these care homes to be operated in a way where its residents may live with dignity and in security, safety, and comfort, and have their physical, psychological, social, spiritual, and cultural needs adequately met.
No, exactly. So it's interesting. I mean, so hey, if anyone out there wants to be the test case, give Doreen or I a call, and it'll be an interesting thing to do. And I can see the hesitation, or maybe I can see the rationale behind maybe why a test case hasn't happened yet, because you're spending potentially tens of thousands of dollars pursuing legal action against a long-term care home for what's likely going to be declaratory relief that, you have to maintain my home in a nicer manner, or you must, stop the abuse. And I can see why maybe people say, well, gee, that cost may not be worth it. But at the same time, I can see why, if the conduct is so egregious, you may say, you know what, enough's enough, I want to enforce my rights. Right. And you have rights.
And maybe it's just a matter of having that conversation with the facility as well, just so that, they'd be inclined to just implement a solution rather than require a court proceeding before they do so.
Exactly. Well, interesting conversation for sure. The future of this act and the Bill of Rights is to be determined at this moment, but hopefully we'll have some answers someday to what kind of framework the court and what kind of obligation and standard of care the court may impose upon long-term care homes. But otherwise, I think our podcast has probably come to a conclusion today. So until next time, we want to thank you for listening. And again, I'm Stuart Clark.
And I'm Doreen So.
And should you have any questions, please feel free to email us at webmaster@hollandhall.com or leave us a comment on our blog. Thank you, Doreen.
Thanks for listening.